If that number is wrong, you are about to lose $900 million. The quiet sentence drifted across the private executive dining room with almost no force at all, yet it instantly became the only sound anyone remembered. Rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, while the city lights reflected across polished marble floors and crystal glass. Inside one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, an elite group of executives surrounded a handcrafted walnut conference table, where a $900 million acquisition was only moments away from becoming official. Ethan Walker, a white billionaire chief executive officer known throughout the financial world for his disciplined instincts and extraordinary business record, adjusted the sleeve of his tailored navy suit as the final legal documents were placed before him. Months of negotiations had led to this evening. Attorneys had reviewed every clause. Investment bankers had refined every valuation. Financial analysts had examined every projection countless times. The chief financial officer smiled with complete confidence as he slid an elegant fountain pen toward Ethan. "Everything has been verified," he said. "We are ready whenever you are." Around the table, directors exchanged satisfied expressions. Several glanced toward the unopened bottles waiting to celebrate another successful transaction. To everyone present, the outcome already felt inevitable. Quietly moving between the executives was Simone Brooks, a black waitress whose calm professionalism made her almost invisible within the luxury surroundings. She refilled coffee cups without interrupting conversations, replaced empty water glasses before anyone noticed, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the value of doing every task well. As she stepped beside the presentation screen, her eyes briefly settled on the valuation summary displayed across it. She immediately looked away. Then she paused. Something inside the financial model refused to make sense. The projected operating margin appeared disconnected from the capital investment assumptions supporting future expansion. It lasted only a glance, yet the inconsistency stayed firmly in her mind. She continued serving coffee while silently reconstructing the relationship between the numbers she had seen. Revenue growth, manufacturing capacity, infrastructure spending, cash flow. Individually, each figure appeared reasonable. Together, they described two completely different businesses. Simone quietly reminded herself that this meeting had nothing to do with her. She worked in hospitality. The people around the table had decades of executive experience. Speaking would almost certainly embarrass her and interrupt one of the most important negotiations of the year. She turned toward the exit with the silver coffee pot in her hand. After taking 2 steps, she stopped. Years of studying finance after late restaurant shifts had taught her one habit she had never abandoned. Whenever the numbers stopped telling the same story, the truth deserved one more look. She gently returned to the conference table just as Ethan reached for the fountain pen. He looked up politely, expecting a routine service question. Instead, Simone spoke with respectful calm. "Excuse me, sir. I believe one number inside the valuation deserves another review." Several executives smiled awkwardly. One analyst quietly laughed beneath his breath. Ethan offered a courteous but dismissive smile. "Thank you," he replied. "But my team has spent months reviewing every detail." Simone nodded. "I understand. I only thought the operating assumptions and the investment assumptions may not be describing the same business." Ethan leaned back comfortably in his chair, amused by the unexpected interruption. "You are very observant," he said with a faint smile. "But this room is full of financial professionals." Simone lowered her voice even further. "That may be true, sir. But if I am mistaken, you lose less than a minute. If I am correct, you may save much more than $900 million. The room fell completely silent as every eye slowly shifted from the unsigned contract to the quiet waitress standing beside the conference table. And for the first time that evening, certainty quietly gave way to curiosity. The silence inside the executive dining room seemed to stretch far beyond a few seconds. Every executive stared first at Simone Brooks, then at the unsigned agreement resting beneath Ethan Walker's hand. Outside, rain continued sliding across the towering glass windows, blurring the lights of Manhattan into shimmering reflections. Inside, confidence had quietly been replaced by uncertainty. Ethan studied Simone with polite skepticism. He had negotiated billion-dollar transactions for nearly 2 decades. Investors trusted his judgment. Governments respected his decisions. Fortune 500 executives competed for meetings with him months in advance. The idea that a waitress might have discovered something his entire advisory team had overlooked seemed almost impossible. Even so, there was something about her calm voice that prevented him from dismissing her completely. She had not sounded emotional. She had not tried to impress anyone. She had simply sounded certain. Ethan looked toward his chief financial officer. How long would it take to verify the section she mentioned? The chief financial officer smiled confidently. Less than 5 minutes, he replied. One senior attorney quietly added, there is no real need. This model has already been reviewed several times. Ethan remained thoughtful before answering. Then another review should not concern anyone. The chief financial officer reopened the financial model, while several analysts gathered around the presentation screen. Simone quietly stepped backward, returning toward the coffee service without another word. She had said everything she believed was necessary. One investment banker glanced toward her with a faint smile. You seem very interested in corporate finance. Simone answered respectfully. I enjoy learning. The banker chuckled politely. Finance is usually more complicated than it appears. Simone simply nodded. Yes, sir. That is why every assumption matters. Her response caused the banker to pause, although he said nothing further. At the front of the room, the chief financial officer expanded the valuation worksheet onto the large display. Which number concerned you? He asked without looking away from the screen. Simone hesitated briefly before answering. The projected operating margin beginning in year 3. Several analysts exchanged puzzled expressions. One quickly replied, that figure comes directly from management guidance. Simone gently shook her head. The percentage itself may be correct. I was wondering whether it still remains possible after the projected capital expansion, shown on another schedule. The chief financial officer stopped typing. He opened a second worksheet beside the first one. His expression became slightly more focused. Another analyst joined him, comparing production forecasts against infrastructure investment. Ethan quietly walked closer to the screen, watching their faces rather than the numbers themselves. He had learned long ago that experienced analysts often revealed uncertainty before speaking it aloud. The room grew increasingly quiet as more spreadsheets appeared across the display. Revenue projections, manufacturing capacity, cash flow assumptions, capital expenditures. One analyst frowned. Another leaned closer to the monitor. The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses before rebuilding part of the model manually instead of relying on the existing formulas. Ethan noticed the confidence slowly disappearing from his team's expressions. Finally, the chief financial officer looked toward one of his senior analysts. Run an independent calculation from the beginning, he instructed. The analyst immediately started rebuilding the operating forecast without referencing the original model. No one reached for the celebration bottles waiting nearby. No one looked toward the contract anymore. Even the attorneys quietly closed their briefcases as they sensed the atmosphere changing. Simone remained standing silently beside the coffee station, her hands resting gently around the silver serving tray. She did not appear pleased. She did not appear anxious. She simply waited while the numbers spoke for themselves. Several long moments later, the senior analyst slowly looked up from his computer with an expression Ethan had rarely seen. I think we need everyone to see this, he said quietly. The operating assumptions are not supporting the valuation we were about to approve. The senior analyst connected his laptop to the presentation system, and within seconds a second valuation model appeared beside the original one. Every conversation inside the executive dining room came to a complete stop. The rain outside had faded into the background. Even the city lights beyond the glass walls seemed less important than the rows of numbers now filling the enormous display. Ethan Walker stood beside the conference table with folded arms, watching carefully as his financial team rebuilt the transaction from the beginning. Nobody wanted to believe there was a serious problem, yet nobody wanted to ignore the possibility either. The chief financial officer calmly compared every operating assumption one line at a time. Revenue projections matched. Debt schedules matched. Tax calculations matched. Discount rates remained identical. Then he reached the capital investment forecast. His fingers stopped moving across the keyboard. He quietly opened another worksheet connected to long-term production capacity. One analyst frowned almost immediately. "That cannot be right," he whispered. Another analyst leaned closer to the screen before opening the supporting schedules. The room remained silent except for the sound of keyboards clicking beneath increasingly focused hands. Ethan noticed the confidence slowly disappearing from familiar faces that rarely showed uncertainty. "Talk to me," he said calmly. The chief financial officer took a slow breath before answering. "The formulas are correct." Ethan nodded. "Then what is wrong?" The chief financial officer enlarged two operating schedules side by side. The valuation assumes extraordinary revenue growth beginning in the third year after acquisition. However, the capital investment plan does not provide enough manufacturing expansion, equipment purchases, or operational infrastructure to support that level of growth. The spreadsheet calculates exactly what we instructed it to calculate. The problem is that two different departments built two different business stories. One attorney quietly removed his glasses. Another executive slowly sat forward in his chair. The realization spread across the room almost instantly. The valuation had not failed because of mathematical mistakes. It had failed because separate assumptions no longer described the same company. Ethan looked directly at the chief financial officer. "Verify it independently." Without hesitation, two additional analysts rebuilt the operating forecast from original source documents instead of copying existing calculations. Minutes passed without anyone speaking. Simone Brooks remained respectfully beside the coffee service, saying nothing further. She understood this moment belonged to the evidence, not to her. Finally, the first analyst completed his review. He slowly looked toward the chief financial officer before quietly saying, "I reached the same conclusion." The second analyst finished less than a minute later. His expression carried the same concern. "So did I." The chief financial officer carefully entered the corrected operating assumptions into the valuation model. Instantly, the projected company value changed across the presentation screen. The room collectively drew a quiet breath. The revised valuation was dramatically lower than the figure printed inside the acquisition agreement. One board member quickly performed the calculation again, using a handheld financial calculator. The difference remained unchanged. Ethan looked at the revised numbers without speaking. $900 million. That was the amount the company would have overpaid if the documents had been signed only moments earlier. No one reached for the celebration waiting nearby. No one smiled. The polished fountain pen remained untouched beside the unsigned contract. Ethan slowly closed the leather folder containing the agreement before looking across the room toward Simone. The confidence that had once filled his expression had disappeared completely. In its place stood genuine respect mixed with quiet disbelief. The woman everyone had mistaken for someone who simply served coffee had become the first person to notice what dozens of experienced professionals had completely overlooked. And at that moment, every executive in the room realized the most valuable insight of the evening had come from the one voice nobody expected to hear. No one spoke for several long seconds. The revised valuation remained frozen on the presentation screen, while every executive quietly absorbed what had almost happened. The difference between the original purchase price and the corrected company value was impossible to ignore. $900 million had disappeared with the adjustment of a single assumption that nobody had questioned until a waitress politely asked for another look. Ethan Walker slowly reached for the leather acquisition folder, then closed it without signing a single page. The soft sound echoed through the executive dining room with surprising weight. It was the sound of a decision that would not be made that evening. The lead attorney immediately understood the message. He carefully collected the signature documents and placed them back inside his briefcase. "The transaction is officially suspended pending a complete financial review," he announced calmly. The chief financial officer nodded without hesitation. "I fully support that recommendation." Ethan looked directly at him. "Not a recommendation," he replied. "A requirement." Every executive around the conference table quietly agreed. There was no disappointment in their expressions anymore. Only relief. One board member leaned back slowly before saying, "We spent months proving that the formulas worked. We never stopped to prove that every department was describing the same business." Another executive quietly added, "We trusted consistency inside individual reports instead of consistency across the entire company." Ethan listened carefully before looking toward the presentation screen once more. "That mistake almost cost our shareholders $900 million. The room fell silent again. Everyone understood that such a loss would have extended far beyond a financial statement. Employees, retirement funds, investors, and future opportunities would all have carried the consequences. Ethan slowly turned toward Simone Brooks, who remained respectfully beside the coffee service exactly where she had stood from the beginning. She had not interrupted anyone after raising her concern. She had not attempted to prove herself while the analysts worked. She had simply waited for the evidence to reach its own conclusion. Ethan walked toward her with measured steps. "Miss Brooks," he said sincerely, "would you join us at the table?" Simone hesitated briefly before placing the silver coffee pot on the service cart and approaching the conference table. Several executives instinctively stood as she reached the empty chair nearest the presentation screen. Earlier that evening, nobody had considered inviting her into the discussion. Now the most accomplished financial professionals in the room respectfully waited for her to sit before continuing. Ethan remained standing. "Before anything else," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Simone looked at him with calm surprise. Ethan continued without hesitation. "When you spoke, I judged your profession instead of your observation. I believed your uniform told me everything I needed to know. I was completely wrong." Simone answered with quiet grace. "You trusted the work of your team. I understand why." Ethan gently shook his head. "No. Trust should never replace curiosity." Those words settled deeply across the room. The chief financial officer looked toward Simone with genuine admiration. "Would you help us understand exactly what you noticed?" Simone nodded politely. "It was never only one number," she explained. "The operating margin and the investment plan were both reasonable by themselves. They became impossible only when they were expected to exist together. One forecast described a company growing faster than the other forecasts could physically support." Several analysts immediately reopened their laptops, not because they doubted her explanation, but because they wanted to learn from it. The atmosphere inside the room had completely transformed. Authority no longer belonged to titles or expensive suits. It belonged to evidence, thoughtful reasoning, and the quiet confidence of someone who cared more about the truth than about being recognized for finding it. Simone Brooks slowly stood and walked toward the presentation screen, her movements calm and unhurried despite the attention of every executive in the room. She did not carry herself like someone who had just proven a room full of experienced professionals wrong. Instead, she carried herself like someone who simply wanted the business to reach the correct decision. Ethan Walker stepped aside, giving her a clear view of the financial model. The gesture alone surprised several board members. Less than 20 minutes earlier, he had politely dismissed her observation. Now the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar company was inviting her to explain a valuation model to some of the country's most respected financial specialists. Simone accepted the presentation remote with both hands before enlarging two schedules side by side. "May I explain the way I noticed the inconsistency?" she asked. Ethan nodded immediately. "Please do." Simone highlighted the projected operating margin before selecting the capital investment schedule connected to manufacturing expansion. "Neither of these sections is incorrect by itself," she began. "The challenge appears only when they are expected to happen at the same time." Several analysts leaned closer to their screens. The chief financial officer quietly opened the same worksheets on his laptop. Simone continued speaking in simple language rather than complicated financial terminology. "Imagine a business expecting to serve twice as many customers within a short period of time. Higher revenue may certainly be possible. However, if the company does not also expand its production facilities, hire additional employees, purchase more equipment, or increase operational capacity, the projected growth becomes difficult to achieve. The financial model assumes extraordinary performance without providing the resources necessary to support it." A thoughtful silence settled across the room. One senior analyst slowly nodded. "The business story breaks even though the mathematics remain correct." Simone smiled politely. "Exactly. Numbers should describe reality. When different departments build assumptions independently, The formulas can still calculate perfectly while the business itself stops making sense. The chief financial officer carefully reviewed the supporting schedules once more before quietly saying, "She is absolutely correct." Another analyst reopened the original due diligence reports. "We verified each department separately. We never verified whether every department described the same future." Ethan remained completely focused on Simone. "How did you notice it so quickly?" he asked. Simone hesitated for only a moment. "Whenever I study financial statements, I ask myself one question before I look at anything else." Ethan folded his arms with genuine curiosity. "What question?" Simone answered softly. "If every forecast inside this model becomes true, could the company physically accomplish what the numbers promise?" Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. It sounded almost too simple, yet no one could deny its effectiveness. The chief financial officer slowly closed his laptop. "That question would have saved us months of unnecessary work." Ethan looked around the conference table. Every executive who had quietly smiled when Simone first spoke now listened with complete respect. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned her right to speak. The authority in the room had shifted naturally, not because she demanded recognition, but because evidence had earned it for her. Ethan smiled for the first time since the meeting had begun, although this smile carried none of the earlier confidence that had bordered on dismissal. It carried gratitude. "Miss Brooks," he said sincerely, "today you did far more than prevent an expensive mistake. You reminded every person in this room that intelligence is not measured by a business title, an office, or a tailored suit. It is measured by the willingness to observe carefully and the courage to speak when something does not make sense." Simone lowered the presentation remote onto the conference table and quietly replied, "Sometimes the smallest question protects the biggest decisions." Those words remained suspended in the room long after she finished speaking, because everyone understood they had just learned a lesson that would influence every important decision they made from that day forward. The atmosphere inside the executive dining room softened after the discussion ended, yet no one seemed interested in leaving. The unsigned acquisition documents remained safely inside the attorney's briefcase, but another conversation had quietly become far more important than the transaction itself. Ethan Walker looked toward Simone Brooks with genuine curiosity rather than executive authority. "May I ask you something?" he said gently. Simone smiled politely. "Of course." Ethan hesitated for a brief moment before speaking again. "Where did you learn to analyze financial models like that?" Every executive around the conference table waited silently for her answer. Simone folded her hands calmly before responding. "I studied finance in college for 2 years." Several people exchanged surprised glances. Ethan listened carefully as she continued. "I planned to complete my degree, but my mother became seriously ill. Her medical treatments required more money than my family could afford. So I left school and accepted a full-time position here because it offered stable income and health insurance." She looked briefly toward the silver coffee service resting quietly against the wall. "I always believed I would return to my studies someday." The room remained completely silent. There was no sadness in Simone's voice. She spoke with simple honesty, as though describing an ordinary chapter of life rather than a personal sacrifice. Ethan quietly asked another question. "Did you stop studying after leaving college?" Simone gently shook her head. "Never." A faint smile appeared across her face. "Every evening after finishing work, I visited the public library. I borrowed finance textbooks, downloaded annual reports from public companies, rebuilt valuation models using publicly available information, and compared how successful businesses made long-term decisions. I wanted to understand the stories hidden behind the numbers." The chief financial officer looked genuinely impressed. "You taught yourself all of this while working full-time?" Simone nodded modestly. "Learning does not depend entirely on a classroom. It depends on whether someone remains curious." Those words settled deeply throughout the room. One board member quietly removed his glasses before speaking. "Many people wait for opportunity before preparing themselves. You prepared long before opportunity ever arrived." Simone smiled softly. "I never imagined tonight would happen. I only believed that if I continued learning, perhaps one day I could help solve a problem that mattered." Ethan slowly walked toward the panoramic windows overlooking the city before turning back toward her. Earlier that evening he had noticed only a waitress performing her responsibilities with professionalism. Now he saw years of quiet discipline, determination, and self-education, hidden behind a uniform that most people had never bothered to look beyond. He realized how easily appearances had shaped his first judgment. "I owe you more than an apology," he admitted sincerely. "I underestimated your potential because I focused on your position." Simone answered with calm kindness. "Many people make quick assumptions. What matters most is whether they are willing to change those assumptions after discovering the truth." The chief financial officer smiled thoughtfully. "That may be the most valuable lesson any of us learned tonight." Around the conference table, accomplished executives reflected quietly upon their own careers. Prestigious universities, celebrated promotions, and impressive titles had all played important roles in their success. Yet the person who protected the company from a $900 million mistake had spent years studying alone after long restaurant shifts, expecting nothing except the chance to become a little wiser each day. Ethan realized that genuine brilliance rarely announces itself with recognition. More often it grows quietly through perseverance, humility, and the discipline to keep learning long after the world has stopped expecting extraordinary things from ordinary people. As the lights of Manhattan shimmered beyond the rain-washed windows, every person in the room understood that they had not merely discovered remarkable intelligence that evening. They had discovered remarkable character. The executive dining room remained illuminated long after the acquisition meeting officially ended. Outside, the rain had disappeared, leaving the Manhattan skyline glowing beneath thousands of lights. Inside, however, something far more significant than the weather had changed. Ethan Walker gathered every executive before anyone left the room. His voice carried the quiet confidence that had made him one of the country's most respected business leaders. But tonight there was a new sense of humility beneath every word. "Before we go home," he began calmly, "I want everyone to understand that tonight was not simply about avoiding a $900 million mistake. Tonight revealed a weakness in the way we make decisions." Every executive remained silent. Ethan slowly walked toward the presentation screen where the corrected valuation model still filled the display. "We believed experience alone protected us from error. We believed titles automatically deserved greater trust than thoughtful questions. That belief almost became our most expensive mistake." Several board members quietly lowered their eyes. No one attempted to disagree because the evidence remained visible before them. The chief financial officer spoke next. "Our review process rewarded agreement more than independent thinking. We checked formulas repeatedly, but we stopped challenging assumptions." Ethan nodded. "That changes today." He turned toward the company's general counsel and the head of corporate strategy. "Beginning immediately, every acquisition review will include an independent challenge session. During that session, every employee involved with the process, regardless of position or department, has the right to question any assumption supported by evidence. No concern will ever be dismissed because of a job title." A thoughtful silence spread across the room. One senior director smiled with quiet admiration. "That may become the most valuable policy this company has ever adopted." Another executive added, "The strongest organizations are not the ones where everyone agrees. They are the ones where people feel safe asking difficult questions." Ethan looked toward Simone Brooks. Tonight proved that wisdom is not assigned by organizational charts. It belongs to the people willing to observe carefully and speak honestly. Simone answered with the same humility she had shown all evening. "I simply hoped someone would look at the numbers one more time." The chief financial officer smiled warmly. "And because you did, every one of us became better at our jobs." One by one, several executives approached Simone personally. An investment banker who had quietly smiled when she first interrupted the meeting extended his hand with complete sincerity. "I owe you an apology," he admitted. "I judged your profession before I listened to your reasoning." Simone accepted his handshake graciously. "Thank you. We all make assumptions. The important part is being willing to correct them." Another board member quietly laughed at himself. "After 30 years in finance, I almost ignored the best analysis I heard tonight simply because of who delivered it." Simone answered gently, "Knowledge becomes valuable only when people are willing to hear it." Ethan watched every conversation unfold with growing satisfaction. Earlier that evening, respect inside the room had been distributed according to titles, positions, and reputations. Now respect followed evidence, integrity, and character instead. That change could never be measured on a financial statement, yet he believed it might become the greatest investment his company would ever make. As the executives slowly gathered their briefcases and prepared to leave, Ethan looked once more across the conference table where the unsigned acquisition agreement still rested. He realized that documents, numbers, and negotiations build successful companies, but cultures built on humility sustain them. From that night forward, every important meeting inside Hayes Capital would begin with a simple reminder displayed on the first presentation slide. Listen before judging. Question before assuming. Because the quietest voice in the room may already be protecting everyone else from the mistake they have not yet learned to see. Several weeks passed before Ethan Walker called another executive strategy meeting inside the headquarters of Hayes Capital. The atmosphere inside the boardroom felt different from every meeting that had come before. The first presentation slide no longer displayed projected revenue or acquisition targets. Instead, a single sentence appeared in large letters across the screen. Evidence deserves a voice regardless of where it comes from. Every executive quietly read the message before taking a seat. Ethan entered the room carrying a slim folder rather than the thick acquisition binders everyone expected. After greeting the board, he looked toward the doorway where Simone Brooks stood wearing her restaurant uniform, having arrived after finishing another evening shift. She appeared slightly uncomfortable being invited into a room usually reserved for senior leadership. Ethan smiled warmly. "Please come in." Simone thanked him politely before taking the only empty chair available. Several executives greeted her with genuine respect, a remarkable contrast to the evening when many of them had barely noticed her presence. Ethan waited until everyone settled before speaking. "Today is not about another acquisition," he said calmly. "It is about keeping a promise." He opened the folder and placed a formal letter on the conference table in front of Simone. "Our company operates one of the most competitive strategic analyst development programs in the country. Every applicant completes the same examinations, interviews, financial case studies, and independent evaluations. I would like to invite you to apply." Simone looked at the letter for several quiet seconds without touching it. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That is an incredible opportunity." She paused before continuing. "But I can only accept under one condition." Several executives exchanged curious glances. Ethan smiled gently. "What condition?" Simone looked directly at him. "Please do not make any exceptions because of what happened during the acquisition meeting. I do not want special treatment. If I earn a place in your program, I want it to be because I meet the same standards expected of everyone else." The room became completely silent once again. The chief financial officer slowly smiled. "That answer tells us even more about your character than your financial analysis did." Ethan nodded with obvious admiration. "Then that is exactly how we will proceed. You will complete every assessment, every interview, and every evaluation exactly like every other candidate. Nothing will be easier because of what you accomplished. Nothing will be harder either." Simone finally accepted the letter with a grateful smile. "That is all I hoped to hear." One board member quietly remarked, "Most people ask for opportunities without accountability. You asked for accountability before accepting the opportunity." Simone answered softly, "Opportunities create possibilities. Accountability creates confidence." Ethan looked around the boardroom, noticing how thoughtfully everyone listened to her words. Weeks earlier, executives had measured people by titles and appearances. Now they measured them by integrity, preparation, and evidence. That transformation meant more to him than avoiding a $900 million mistake. It meant the company itself had become stronger. Before the meeting concluded, Ethan addressed the board one final time. "Whether Simone earns this position or not will depend entirely on her performance during the selection process. However, regardless of the outcome, this company will always remember the lesson she gave us. Great organizations are not built by assuming the smartest ideas come from the highest offices. They are built by creating an environment where every thoughtful voice has the chance to be heard." Simone quietly folded the invitation letter and placed it carefully inside her notebook. As she left the boardroom and returned to finish the responsibilities she still carried with professionalism every evening, everyone present understood that the greatest qualification any leader could recognize was not brilliance alone. It was the humility to earn every opportunity with character as well as talent. 6 months later, the executive auditorium at Hayes Capital welcomed employees from every department for the company's annual leadership conference. The room that had once measured success only through financial performance now celebrated something deeper. Screens displayed stories of collaboration, innovation, and thoughtful decision-making. New employees sat beside senior executives without invisible barriers separating their conversations. Ethan Walker stepped onto the stage as warm applause filled the auditorium. He smiled before speaking. "Last year we believed our greatest strength was experience. Today I believe our greatest strength is our willingness to keep learning from one another." The audience responded with quiet attention. Ethan continued, "Many of you know that one evening our company nearly completed an acquisition that would have cost our shareholders $900 million more than it should have. We were protected not by another executive, not by another consultant, but by someone whose insight almost went unheard because of assumptions we made about her position." He paused and looked toward the front row. Simone Brooks smiled modestly, now dressed in professional business attire after successfully completing every examination, interview, financial case study, and evaluation required to earn a position as a strategic financial analyst. She had accepted no shortcuts, requested no special treatment, and earned the respect of every colleague through preparation, discipline, and humility. Ethan invited her onto the stage. The audience rose together in a standing ovation that continued for several moments. Simone accepted the applause with quiet gratitude before Ethan handed her a small framed photograph. It showed the unsigned acquisition agreement resting beside the untouched fountain pen on the night everything changed. Beneath the photograph, a simple inscription had been engraved. "The courage to question protected the wisdom to decide." Simone looked at the words before thanking everyone. "I did not save this company by myself," she said softly. "The numbers were always telling the truth. I simply ask that we listen to them one more time." Real progress happens when people feel safe sharing honest observations, and when leaders remain humble enough to hear them. Her words filled the auditorium with thoughtful silence. Employees recognized themselves in that message regardless of their department or title. Ethan smiled proudly. The greatest investment Hayes Capital has made this year was not another acquisition. It was building a culture where every thoughtful voice matters. Later that afternoon, new employees toured the headquarters. They stopped beside a framed plaque displayed near the executive boardroom entrance. It contained the same reminder Ethan had introduced after that unforgettable evening. Listen before judging. Question before assuming. Several visitors asked about the story behind those words, and longtime employees smiled as they shared how one quiet observation had transformed the company forever. The lesson traveled far beyond conference rooms and financial models. It influenced hiring decisions, leadership training, mentorship programs, and daily conversations throughout the organization. Ethan often reflected that the company had almost lost $900 million because brilliant people forgot one simple truth. Wisdom does not belong exclusively to those with impressive titles. It belongs to those who remain curious, prepared, and courageous enough to speak with humility. Simone never sought recognition for changing the company's future. She simply remained faithful to her principles, and in doing so she reminded everyone that extraordinary leadership often begins with an ordinary person choosing not to remain silent. Long after the numbers had been corrected and the contracts rewritten, people remembered something far more valuable than the money that had been saved. They remembered that true success is measured not only by the decisions leaders make, but by the respect they show every voice willing to protect what is right. Power may open the boardroom door, but humility is what allows wisdom to enter.